When I was talking about The Incredibles 2, I found myself looking back on most Pixar sequels, and I found out they aren't quite as good as I thought they were. Well, all except for Toy Story for the most part, mainly 1 through 3, and how that actually added to the story and concluded it well. But that isn't the case for most of the sequels outside of it, and why they just don't work as well as you think they'd be. The best case of this would be shown in the most hated Cars 2, which really feels like an outlier in between the mess of Cars and Cars 3. I really don't find them any interesting to adding to the overall story or the main characters because of how safe they play it, or how they focus more on the side characters rather than the main ones. Now, this doesn't mean that any of them are really bad, except for the case of Cars 2, they just end up being so unnecessary, especially in the case of Toy Story 4 despite being very good, where actually this whole idea for this video came from me finding out that Toy Story 5 is going to happen, and I'm actually really upset at that, continuing a story that doesn't need to be continued at all. Of course, sequels by themselves aren't inherently bad if you know what you're doing, as all films serve to entertain the audience, and if you do that, there's no real problem, but you really have to have a plan for each story to continue the characters and to serve them in ways that make them refreshed and still enjoyable from what we already know about them. This is the case where we can reference recent films like Puss in Boots from DreamWorks, and of course in the past like Shrek 2, and once again referring to Toy Story 2 and 3. And if you all remember, after the release of Toy Story 2, Pixar actually went on this wild run of gorgeous original animated films that truly made our childhood, starting from Monsters Inc. up to, well, Up. It was almost like year after year of release there was an original film, all of which were truly great masterpieces in my opinion. Well, except for Cars, because that's only a good film by their standards. And each one still felt so connected from each other without being related or being a sequel. But as you can see right here, this was just a great time of creativity and originality that Pixar was really interested in doing after Toy Story 2 that really took the studio off on another level. I mean, looking back on it now, I could have never thought that Ratatouille, WALL-E, and Up was released one year after another, proving how great their ability at creating films really were, and then that was actually followed by one of the greatest animated sequels ever made, being Toy Story 3. And of course, in the case of Toy Story 2 and 3, they actually added something to the story in the journey, showcasing how Andy grew up and concluding how he moved on from that part in his life, giving a new chance for toys to be happy, and it really showcased the power that this franchise held. But then again, in regards to other sequels, the year after that was the release of Cars 2. Now, Cars 2 is actually what happens when they expand upon a side story similar to the Mater Tall-Tale shorts into an entire film, and not actually focusing on the journey of Lightning McQueen, the main character of the original Cars. Now, this film doesn't absolutely suck, but it does something far removed from what the story of Cars was supposed to be to begin with, which actually returned back in Cars 3, but this story lacks cohesion and sense for what the franchise was trying to be about, removing the charm of what makes it special for this spy plot and a character that really isn't the main character. Once again, bringing up the fact that this becomes more of Mater's film rather than Lightning McQueen's film, and that's what made them switch back once again to Cars 3, making this middle film more of that poorly spin-off that didn't handle its characters very well. It's just that this entire spy plot just didn't make sense to begin with when your whole film franchise is about cars and racing, and the villain and the spy characters aren't very interesting at all to add to the world of Cars. And then we started to see this happen in the other sequels that came out with today, with the likes of Finding Dory. It's another great sequel, but still one that pushes out its main characters from the first one to become side ones instead. And of course, that's not to say it's completely bad, I just don't feel like this story would serve the overall story as seen with Cars 2, where I would actually feel like doing something original in its place would have better served the studio otherwise for the current time. Because after the year Dory was released, Cars 3 was actually returning the story of what mattered most, but actually didn't make a difference when you had the middle almost ruin that. This film made less money than Cars 2, and was just an attempt to heal something that was broken that should have been done a lot earlier in the first place. Cars 3 actually should have been the Cars 2, but it didn't end up being that way, where the villain of this story is relatively boring and uninteresting. There isn't very much about him that I would like to know compared to the past, but then again, Cars isn't huge on its antagonist other than people recognizing the fact that Michael Keaton was playing a villain screaming Kachiga everywhere he went. But after the Cars 3 was released, it didn't stop there because next year would be another sequel, this time of course focusing on The Incredibles 2, where as I said at the start of the film, I already tried covering it in detail and why it didn't work and why it shouldn't exist. It's a story where its villain becomes its weakest part, where the story doesn't innovate at all and does the same as the first, with someone who doesn't have great motivations or character in it anyway. There's also a lack of continuing the adult themes that were presented in the first in favor of this shallow story that somehow forgot some parts of its ending, where it feels like people people at the beginning of this very film still blame supers for things and do a 180 yet again at the end when they are made legal. It just becomes evident that where we left most of these movies off, that the sequel was hardly warranted in the first place after waiting so long for them coming out. The time gap of 14 years between The Incredibles and The Incredibles 2 should have gave them ample time to work out the story, but in the end it just ended up being the same, becoming this popcorn movie and nothing more. The whole point of this entire journey was to flip the script for Helen to take Bob's place and have him deal with the family life, and to restore the legality of superheroes in the public. Although if you do remember the ending of The Incredibles, it actually looks like that's exactly what happens where people are cheering for the supers' return. And that's why I just don't feel like this story was any useful at all, starting to question myself for the existence of all Pixar sequels, as Toy Story 4 would actually come out the year later. It was just back to back to back from 2016 to 2019 that Pixar would produce a sequel to the fan favorite film. Now of course, as discussed before, Toy Story 4 is yet another great sequel for the franchise, but one that hardly felt was needed to begin with when Toy Story 3 ended so well. It ended the real story about Andy's toys and passes it on to a new generation, where this one focuses on the fact of becoming lost toys, where Woody goes on this journey of being rejected and forgotten by Bonnie, where at the end of the film he finally decides to join Bo Peep, a character who we have not seen since Toy Story 2, to help find other toys find new homes. Yes, Toy Story 4 is a heartwarming story where I almost wanted to cry when Buzz and Woody said goodbye, but then again, you kind of feel like it ruined the perfect ending than what we knew about Toy Story from Toy Story 3, that they undid the meaning that satisfied the very audience. So when you look at that from that perspective, Toy Story 4 is actually a bad sequel that destroyed the works that came before it and added no real value because it comes after the era of the main kid. The story might have been about these toys, specifically Buzz and Woody, but then again it all related back to Andy. Even in Lightyear, the recent film released by Pixar, referenced how this entire film is a film within the world of films of Toy Story and how it was Andy's favorite movie. Everything actually circles back to his character and his journey with his toys and moving on from that fact. Where now evidently we've moved on from that with Bonnie, where she stopped caring about Woody, the most important toy that he gave her, in the moment where he highlighted him out of every single toy and what he meant to him, and how Bonnie actually took that to heart and now barely notices him in the sequel. Something that really destroys the finale on the level you couldn't see and the circumstances of the film. I mean, if you take one look at this entire conversation that they have, you actually get to see how much Woody actually meant to his entire life and what he gave to Bonnie in that very film, where she actually loved to play with him. And now you actually start to see why this sequel doesn't make any sense at all, with her forgetting about him and now making a Toy Story 5 that would literally kill the entire story for good. I'm not saying it will be bad in any way, with the impossible happening with each sequel becoming so great, but there is a point where the story does not need to continue unless you have some sort of expanded universe or whatnot like Star Wars or Marvel, and Toy Story is not that. Sure, it might have lots of characters with different stories like the rest, but it stifles any sense of creativity or meaning towards the last one when you just constantly keep pushing it out, because if you can't improve upon the story like what happened with 4, then everything you set out to achieve with the newer film is a complete waste of time that could have been better served to do something else. Of course, after releasing Toy Story 4, they actually went back to doing mostly original films. I say mostly because of how Lightyear came out, becoming a spin-off that takes place in the world of Toy Story as we discussed earlier. The film is a film within a film that encouraged Andy to get Buzz Lightyear in the first place, which actually retconned the whole point of Buzz Lightyear of Star Command, a much better movie and series than what this film produced, acting more like a reboot to that film Andy saw when he was a child. And this entire movie felt shackled by leaning too heavily on a property instead of any type of story that they probably originally had planned for this. Where of course it's not only just sequels for Pixar, but any adaptations of their previous properties to create newer stories, where it sort of ruins any established point than what we know of the characters. The ends really don't justify the means when it's all mostly for profit, just like those soulless live action films. It's just that the thing with Pixar is not about its sequels at all, but the solo stories that have heart being unique from each other, but still continuing that Pixar shine, if you know what I mean. Every new piece that they produce has an interesting theme or story to tell, and doing a sequel for them really doesn't add any value to that, lacking all the messages that they originally had in favor of a more visually improved endeavor that's only innovative story was to redo some of the unimportant story presented from before and making that take center stage. And this all relates to the problem of Disney itself and the search for doing more of the same and not innovating at all with its remakes and sequels. And you can actually see this within Disney Animation themselves, where of course they started to do sequels well before Pixar with the direct-to-DVDs like the Aladdins and the Beauty and Beast, and then continued on with that with doing the theatrical releases of Ralph Breaks the Internet and Frozen 2, where they literally add nothing to a story, where they don't have a villain or a compelling story to begin with. It's astonishing how this entire company is betraying everything that Walt Disney himself built when he didn't even believe in doing sequels. It's not to say that he couldn't stop doing that because that was inevitable for a studio to do after his death in order to make money and continue to be profitable, and doesn't mean that they aren't capable of having stories improved upon the first by what we discussed earlier in films like Tron Legacy being the greatest sequel ever made in my opinion, but you just can't expect everything to become a success for this company to do the same exact thing they've already done. But for this company to bring back the glory days, they have to start adapting the same exact stories we've already seen them do, or just do something that warrants the story to continue. But looking at the failures we've seen so far, I highly doubt that is going to be a remote possibility, but like I said, the future is always uncertain, so we'll just have to wait and see for that to come. So with that said, I am all done now, so goodbye.